Welcome back to another deep dive. Let's start today with a thought experiment that might give you a bit of an existential crisis. I want you to imagine that you do not exist. And I don't mean that in some poetic or metaphorical way. I mean literally, there is no you sitting there listening to this podcast. There is no chair you are sitting on, no headphones on your ears. In fact, according to a philosophical view called Eliminativist Microphysical Nihilism, or EMN for short, the only material things that actually exist in the universe are submicroscopic simples. Just tiny, fundamental particles, no composite objects whatsoever. No tables, no mountains, and definitely no human beings. Today, we are grabbing a coffee with a fascinating paper by philosopher Cody Gilmore called The Cogito and Sums. Gilmore is trying to rescue our existence, specifically through Descartes' famous Cogito argument, I think, therefore I am. But he is doing it in a very modern, incredibly clever way. So, to help unpack this mind-bending debate, I am joined by my co-host. Let's start with the background here. How exactly do we get from particles exist to I don't exist?
It is great to be here, and yes, it is quite the philosophical rabbit hole. To understand Gilmore's paper, we first need to define that massive term you just dropped, Eliminativist Microphysical Nihilism, or EMN. It is a form of compositional nihilism. This is the view that no composite material objects exist at all, only simples, which are things with no proper parts. EMN takes this and adds two specific claims. First, that you and I and everyday objects are composite material objects. Second, that the only simples that exist are submicroscopic, like elementary particles or space-time points. Because composition never happens, ordinary objects never get built. Therefore, you and I do not exist. Now, Peter van Inwagen famously proposed a view called organicism, which is just one short step away from EMN. He agreed that tables and chairs do not exist, but he made an exception for living organisms. He argued that when simples are arranged in a way that constitutes a living organism, they actually do compose something. He tried to use a Cogito-like argument, basically saying that thinking requires a composite object, because simples cannot collectively plan for tomorrow or feel pain. But compositional nihilists just were not convinced by van Inwagen. They felt it begged the question. So, Gilmore is stepping in to try a totally new strategy against these nihilists.
Right, which brings us to the classic Cartesian cogito. The structure is famously simple. Premise 1, I am conscious. Premise 2, if I am conscious, then I exist. Therefore, conclusion, I exist. Now, Gilmore focuses heavily on the word conscious here. Why is being conscious the magic ticket to proving existence in this argument? Why not use something like, I am wearing shoes?
That is a crucial point. Gilmore introduces a concept here called an existence-securing condition. This means that if you plug a condition into the blank in the sentence, if alpha blank, then alpha exists, the sentence will always be true, no matter what you put in for alpha. For example, does not exist is not an existence-securing condition. If you say, if the fictional planet Vulcan does not exist, then Vulcan exists, that is obviously false. But is wearing shoes is existence securing? If you are wearing shoes, you must exist to wear them. Is conscious is also existence securing. The reason the Cogito relies on I am conscious rather than I am wearing shoes is purely epistemic. You can be absolutely certain that you are conscious, even if you are hallucinating or dreaming. You might just be dreaming you have shoes on, but the fact that you are experiencing the dream means you are conscious. It is the one existence-securing property that has an undeniable, unquestionable defense.
Okay, so, I am conscious is the ultimate anchor. But here is the problem. The people Gilmore is arguing against, the EMN sympathizers, they just deny premise 1. They flat out refuse to say, I am conscious, because they do not believe the I exists. But they do concede that something conscious-ish is happening. So, how does Gilmore convince someone who won't even admit they exist?
He uses an indirect, brilliant method that he calls the abductive metacogito. The word abductive is key here. He is not trying to force the nihilist into a logical corner with a deductive proof. Instead, he uses inference to the best explanation. He says, look, even if you deny I am conscious, we both agree there are certain undeniable data points about our conscious experience. He sets up 4 incredibly complex, almost sci-fi scenarios and says we can all be completely certain that these 4 nightmare scenarios are false in our actual reality. He then compares Cartesianism, which is the view that I am conscious is a certainty, against a bunch of EMN-friendly alternatives to see which theory best explains why we are so certain these 4 scenarios are false.
Let's lay out those 4 data points, because they are wild. We have the nihilist zombie world, where no one is conscious. We have the I-zombie world, where other things might be conscious but I am a zombie. We have panpsychist hell, which is a horrific scenario involving pain. And finally, their heaven, my hell. These are the four realities we know for a fact we are not living in. So, let's test the nihilist alternatives against these. What is the first alternative the EMN sympathizer tries to use instead of I am conscious?
The first alternative is counterfactualism. Because the nihilists cannot say, I am conscious, they say something like, if all the simples were just as they actually are, but these simples actually compose something, then I would be conscious. It is a hypothetical workaround. But Gilmore points out a fatal flaw here, which he calls the missing categorical content problem. Categorical content means what is actually happening right now in reality, not just in some what-if scenario. Counterfactualism only tells us what would happen conditionally. It completely fails to explain our certainty that we are not in the first scenario, the nihilist zombie world. A world where absolutely nothing is actually conscious is perfectly logically consistent with the statement, if particles compose me, I would be conscious. Because counterfactualism lacks actual categorical claims about the present, it cannot rule out the zombie world. So, it fails step 1.
That makes total sense. You cannot replace the raw reality of an experience with a hypothetical if-then statement. So the nihilist has to try something that makes a claim about reality right now. What is the next EMN-friendly alternative?
The next attempt is plural generalism. This is the view that says, okay, we won't say I am conscious, but we can be certain that some things are conscious. In symbolic logic, this is roughly there exists some x's such that they are conscious. But this runs into a different wall, which Gilmore calls the missing de re content problem. De re basically means about the specific thing. Plural generalism is too vague. It just says consciousness is happening somewhere, to some things. This completely fails to explain our certainty regarding the second scenario, the iZombie world. Imagine a world where your neighbor's particles are conscious, but the particles sitting in your chair right now are just mindless zombies. The statement some things are conscious is still completely true in that world. So plural generalism cannot explain why I am absolutely certain that I am not a zombie. It lacks the de-re content that points specifically to right here, right now.
It is too generalized. It proves someone is having a good time, but it doesn't prove that I am having the experience. So the nihilist realizes they need to narrow it down. What if they focus on the experience itself, rather than the objects?
That leads us to the third and fourth alternatives, which are experience generalism and experience particularism. Experience generalism just says, there is an experience. But this fails for the exact same reason as the last one. It lacks de re content. It doesn't rule out the iZombie world because an experience could be happening to anyone else. So, following a suggestion from the philosopher Rudolph Carnap, the nihilist tries experience particularism. This view says, this is an experience. You just mentally point to the feeling you are having right now. It finally has de re content. It points specifically to times this, but Gilmore shows it still fails because of the negative certainties problem, specifically when we look at the third data point, panpsychist hell.
Oh, panpsychist hell. This is where it gets really interesting. Walk us through why this is an experience fails to protect us from panpsychist hell.
Imagine a scenario called E de Chamonix. Suppose this specific experience of reading a paper or drinking coffee exists, but instead of being attached to a unified subject, this exact experience is somehow had collectively by a swarm of subatomic particles, and those particles are simultaneously in agonizing horrible pain. That is panpsychist hell. The proposition this is an experience is logically compatible with panpsychist hell. The mere existence of this experience does not guarantee that the things having this experience aren't also experiencing horrific torture in the background. Because experience particularism cannot logically rule out this E de Chamonix scenario, it cannot explain why we are so incredibly certain that we are not currently in panpsychist hell.
Wow. So just pointing to the experience isn't enough, because it disconnects the experience from the boundaries of the subject having it. We need a way to bind the experience to a specific subject, or in the nihilist's case, a specific group of particles. This brings us to what Gilmore considers the absolute strongest rival to Cartesianism. What is it, and how does it hold up?
The strongest EMN-friendly alternative is plural particularism, or PLP. This view says, these are conscious. You are mentally pointing precisely to these time-specific simples that make up your brain and body right now. PLP is a heavy hitter. It solves the categorical problem because it says, consciousness is happening now. It solves the de-re problem because it points to these time-specific things. It successfully explains our certainty that we are not in the zombie world, not in the iZombie world, and not in panpsychist hell. It looks like the nihilist might actually win here, but Gilmore pulls out his final, most complex data point, scenario 4, their heaven, my hell.
The final boss of the thought experiments. What exactly is their heaven, my hell, and why does it break plural particularism?
Let's visualize this carefully. Imagine a scenario where these specific particles, the ones currently in your brain, are having a wonderful heavenly experience. They are completely blissed out. However, at the exact same time, I, as a distinct subject, am experiencing unimaginable torment in hell. Now, you and I know with absolute certainty that this scenario is false, because if the particles that make up my brain are in heaven, I cannot be in hell. But let's look at the logic of PLP, which asserts these particles are conscious. The proposition these particles are conscious does not logically entail that I am not in hell. Why? Because EMN strictly denies that I exist. If EMN is true, these particles and I are totally disconnected concepts. Therefore, from the nihilist, strictly logical standpoint, the statement, these particles are experiencing heaven is entirely logically compatible with the horrific proposition that I am experiencing hell. If you try to add supplementary propositions to PLP to fix this, Gilmore argues those additions are either totally ad hoc, meaning they are just made up to save the theory, or they require making claims that go way beyond what we can actually be certain of. PLP just cannot cross the finish line.
That is a brilliant checkmate. Because the nihilist refuses to acknowledge the I, they can never logically link the well-being of the particles to the well-being of the actual subject experiencing reality. They can never rule out their heaven, my hell. So, let's bring it all back to Gilmore's conclusion. Does this mean Descartes was 100% right all along, and nihilism is definitively crushed?
This is exactly where we have to be very careful to match the actual strength of Gilmore's conclusion. He is not saying this is a flawless, deductive proof that completely destroys nihilism. Remember, this is the abductive metacogito. It is about explanatory power. Cartesianism simply says that the original premise, I am conscious, is true and certain. And if you accept that, Cartesianism effortlessly and beautifully explains all four data points. It rules out the zombie world, the I-zombie world, panpsychist hell, and their heaven, my hell, all with perfect logical harmony. It is a far simpler and more unified explanation than any EMN-friendly alternative. So, Gilmore's actual conclusion is an epistemic one. He says that if you are an EMN sympathizer, this argument provides powerful abductive support for Cartesianism. It should raise your confidence in the cogito. In the paper, he explicitly says he does not believe Cartesianism to a degree of 1, but this argument might take an EMN sympathizer from a confidence level of, say, 0.4 up to about 0.7. It makes the belief in the I significantly better justified than it was before.
I love that nuance. It is not about screaming, I proved you wrong, at the nihilists. It is like sitting across from them at the coffee shop and saying, look at how much cleaner and more elegant my explanation is for the reality we both agree we are experiencing. Maybe it's time to admit that the I is doing a lot of heavy lifting. We took a wild journey from empty universes with just particles, through zombie worlds and panpsychist hells, all to arrive back at a slightly more mathematically confident version of, I think, therefore, I am. This has been an incredibly illuminating breakdown of the abductive metacogito. For everyone listening, next time you doubt your own existence, just remember that proving you are not in their heaven, my hell, is a pretty good reason to believe in yourself. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time on Philosophical Frontiers.